Welcome to the final part of my blow-by-blow review of Climate the Movie. If you've not watched the first two parts, I would recommend that you do, since they deal predominantly with the scientific claims made in the movie, and that underpins everything we'll be talking about in this video, which mostly is about the politics. I will say up front that I had believed, and rather hoped, because I'm an optimistic sort of a fellow, that this would be where I would find more points where we had agreements, because there are lots of valid criticisms to be made of some of the claims of campaigners, some of the policy choices of governments, and there was some of that. But from the very beginning of this next part, I realised that Climate the Movie was going to go out of its way to make it really difficult for me just to say, yep, that statement there is fair comment. And that's because I realised of the whole version of reality that it's trying to sell to you. So let's dive into it.
Until the 1980s, global warming was little more than an eccentric scare story put about by radical environmentalists.
Say what? That, as a proposition, is best described as nonsense on stilts. Because, of course, global warming was a scientifically developed theory long before environmentalists even existed, let alone adopted it as a key thing that they were concerned about. Joseph Fourier identified the greenhouse effect in 1824. John Tyndall was the first to measure infrared absorption and emission of gases from 1859. Svante Arrhenius made the first prediction of global warming due to increased atmospheric carbon in 1896, and the evidence built from there. In 1938, Guy Callender connected the observed CO2 increases in Earth's atmosphere to global warming. In the 1960s and 1970s, the number of research papers looking at this increased, leading to a developing foundational understanding. So, not just an eccentric scare story, no, and nothing to do with environmentalists at the time, who were only just starting to appear in their modern incarnation, and they were much more concerned with localised pollution issues. So why, you might ask, has the movie framed it that the issue started with environmentalists?
But then the cause was picked up by an ambitious young senator, Al Gore.
Because they want you to believe it was driven by the politics, not by science. By the way, one of the first political leaders to pick it up actually was Margaret Thatcher, who did something that modern-day conservatives could probably learn from. The scientifically trained Thatcher acknowledged what the evidence suggested, its implications for decision-makers at the time, and then made her case why her political tradition was best suited in responding to the challenge. The issue was also taken seriously by the US President George H.W. Bush, another conservative, albeit not such an important shaper as his predecessor Ronald Reagan. So the idea that this was some obscure thing promoted by wild-eyed leftist campaigners until it was plucked from the ether by Al Gore, that is a serious rewriting of history. Not to mention a rewriting that imagines the United States to be the only place where anything was happening. So you ask again, why has the movie framed it that way? Well, then we get to the punchline.
$1 billion a year of public money was made available for research into climate change. This quickly rose to $2 billion. Academic researchers in various disciplines began to apply for this climate funding.
So there's the argument. Wild idea by environmentalists, picked up by Al Gore, suddenly generously funded. So then an entire community of scientists, painted in this telling as being universally shallow and unscrupulous to a degree never previously seen in such a large body of people in history, they all chased for money and hence invented modern climate science.
Academics of every kind lined up for climate funding. Climate became an exciting new area of interest for sociologists.
You can see why that would be very powerful propaganda. It's just not how it happened. and presumably anyone not so deeply in the trenches as to still care about the truth does care about how it actually happened. You can arguably trace it back to 1974, when Henry Kissinger, concerned about data he was seeing from internal government reports, made two speeches. In April of that year at the United Nations General Assembly, he talked about the possibility of climate changes in the monsoon belt and perhaps all around the world. This was, he said, a threat to global balance. 6 months later, at the World Food Conference in Rome, he referred to the danger of recurrent droughts in provoking food crises. Kissinger and the CIA at the time, not being influenced by the stupidity of where the debaters arrived at in modern discourse, they did what should be the obvious thing to do. They encouraged the development of climate science so that America could spot the reality of what might or might not be bearing down on it. That's where you do what you do to become aware of a risk. You try to get good information. The CIA said at the time, it is increasingly evident that intelligence must understand the magnitude of international threats due to climate change. And it added, climate prediction methodologies are necessary to prevent political and economic collapses of nations caused by the fall in food production. Moreover, methodologies are also needed to project and assess the inclination of nations to militarily initiate large-scale migrations as have occurred over the past 4,000 years. Those were the concerns, informed by history and the impacts that climate changes had had in the past. One, that droughts and other events could impact food production, leading to geopolitical instability. And two, that as a consequence of any large-scale changes, there might be large human migrations, which would be equally destabilising. So it was in our interest to know what was going on. This moment came, by the way, when Al Gore was just 26, hadn't been elected as a senator yet, let alone as vice president. So, no. Just like he didn't invent the internet, he didn't invent climate science either. From there, the growth of climate science gathered momentum. And look, it is absolutely the case that when a political administration, whether Al Gore, Bill Clinton, or indeed Joe Biden's, starts throwing lots of money around, it has a distorting effect that can have unintended consequences. And the movie justifiably points at some of the eccentric outcomes of some of that, particularly where the non-climate related fields start queuing up to get in on the act.
Thousands of papers were published on climate change and prostitution, climate change and beer, climate change and the Black Death, climate change and disability, climate change and video games, and everything else imaginable.
There is absolutely a fair comment critique to be made of some of that stuff. Indeed, to be made of some of the choices made within the social sciences community overall in recent years. The critique still needs to be done with integrity. What we get here is a lumping in of all of that stuff with the core scientific community looking at the physics and the geology and the biology of climate change. If you were going to detail specifically and accurately how climate science developed and the requirements or not of the funding, then you might be able to make an argument that there had been some wider biases introduced into the processes and to be able to evaluate properly how influential they'd been. But they don't do that. Instead, it's all black and white. They misrepresent the history. They presume all scientists to be money-seeking charlatans, with the exception of the handful of heroic skeptics.
If Congress is willing to pay you to find evidence of global warming, by golly, as a scientist, we're going to go find evidence of it, because that's what we're being paid to do. And guess what? If you don't find evidence or say the evidence suggests it's not a problem, your funding ends. This totally corrupts the way we look at the science.
Unfortunately, given the first 45 minutes of the movie, where the science they presented as an alternative rattled through 4 different claims on what's happening with global warming, presenting each one with certainty and completely skipping over the mutual incompatibility between them, and the fact they did this by clearly misrepresenting data, cherry-picking a very small number of sources, what they could find, it's hard to take those claims seriously. Because if a foundation of climate science was built, as they say, on wholly erroneous grounds, purely because foolish ideologues had sloshed money into it, first, you would expect different results in other countries where Al Gore and all that money had not been a factor. And second, the skeptics would have been able to produce a much more solid and reasoned critique of the resulting science in that first part of the movie than they have. And one more thing worth noting as well at this stage.
The climate alarm brought funds, and the bigger the supposed threat, the more funds seemed to flow. The publicly funded science establishment now had a direct financial interest in playing up the alarm.
How would this look different if the data was solid and, let's say, concern rather than alarm were wholly justified? The answer is it wouldn't. It would look exactly like it does. Arguably, if it was really all down to Al Gore and the corruption of funding, there would be many more people calling it out as wrong and corrupt, rather than just the same faces we see in this movie that we've seen over and over again. Then we get told that all of this has led to the climate bandwagon.
Western governments and their senior civil servants were more than willing to address the climate problem.
Were they, though? I mean, that's not how I remember it. There has been, since 1989, huge resistance to actually taking action on this agenda. Why would a politician think it was a great idea to pursue a policy that pays off in the long term, and even worse, will pay off by avoiding a problem, which you never get credit for because that's an invisible benefit? An invisible future benefit with a current visible cost. How is that a dream equation for politicians? And in so doing, to make people's lives potentially more difficult in the short term. When the other crises and problems they have to deal with on a much more immediate day-to-day basis require quite enough trade-offs to potentially damage any politician's re-election chances as it is. And this is exactly why the campaigners have been using all the crisis language, using the arguably ill-advised deadline metaphors, 10 years or 2 years or 5 minutes or whatever to save the planet. They've been trying to create a sense of urgency to get over that inertia, which if a version of reality this movie pushes had been true, would not have been necessary. But then over time, things did start to get done, at least some of the easier wins, and this is then represented as simply spreading the conflicts of interest into every other sphere of life.
Green subsidies and regulation meant there was now money to be made in climate. Renewables firms sprouted. Consultancy firms offered advice on what they called sustainability and climate compliance.
Again, that is also what you would expect to happen. Businesses particularly looking to change and adapt to the goods and services that will be demanded in the future. Those who resist change, businesses are only too aware, end up like Blockbuster or IBM. I love, by the way, the little clip here of the sustainability advisors looking suitably shifty and smug, and it's side by side with this overall summary.
But therein lies the one great threat to this multi-trillion-dollar industry. All the jobs, all of the funding, are totally dependent on there being a climate crisis.
But businesses have consultants for many things. The implication that if climate change wasn't a scare story, then all these people would be languishing in unemployment, wailing and gnashing their teeth. It's obviously ridiculous. They would just look at what was valued in the marketplace instead and train themselves to be useful to businesses in those areas. That's how business works. Just the same that it's entirely natural that some of the old businesses who resist change on their way to commercial obsolescence, they spend most of their time fighting back against change. Because yes, change is hard. Nobody enjoys it. We then reach the self-pity part of the narrative.
Editors of academic journals came under pressure not to accept papers which were deemed to be skeptical of the climate crisis. Scientists who dared to point out in public that there was no climate chaos began to be sidelined and shunned.
Personally, again, I think you could mount a robust critique of failings in scientific journal processes. They wouldn't be as dramatic as claimed here, but they would be important nonetheless and well worth highlighting. Unfortunately, the scientists who, earlier in this movie, stood shoulder to shoulder with truly garbage claims based on doctored graphs, misrepresented data, cherry-picked sources. Well, I'm sorry, but when you do that, you kind of lose credibility arguing that you can't get funded and that's because you're being persecuted by the climate agenda. Is it that? Or are you maybe failing to meet the quality threshold? Everyone thinks they're Galileo, but generally they're not. Have there been cases of inexcusable groupthink, personal vendettas, individual injustices? Without a doubt. Humans are humans. Does that extend to the whole of climate science and everyone who wants to make a name for themselves as a contrarian? Again, if that were the case, we would have seen a stronger case made in the science part of this movie. The justice of that case would be more powerfully promoted without being associated with quackery. Quackery that presents graphs with the modern bit, the bit that contradicts the message specifically left off, that tells you that Central Park, New York is relevant, but not Southern Europe, mind, which is actually one of the areas where it's predicted we will see the earliest trends, and when you look at the data, we do. Okay, we then move on to deeper into the politics, but we can still only do so on the basis of the fantasy reality that's been set out for us.
From the start, the climate scare was political. It came from the environmental movement, the sworn enemy of free market industrial capitalism.
As we've seen, no it didn't. If they weren't framing this so stupidly, we could probably reach an agreement on some of the key points that they're about to make. Because yes, some of the ones in the environmental movement who latched onto climate change are indeed motivated by leftist political agendas, like the founders of Extinction Rebellion, such as Roger Hallam, who have recorded that the early discussions were about how they could mobilise a mass movement to bring down the government, and they decided that climate change was the issue, was the vehicle by which they could do so. And that was entirely consistent with their subsequent messaging, with the extreme doomism that was a number of times criticised and condemned by the mainstream climate science community, as well as by me on this channel, by the way. So it didn't work for them, because the approach attracted people who were scared of climate change, not necessarily more people who were going to go along with the leftist revolutionary agenda, which was one reason why Roger Hallam was eventually thrown out of Extinction Rebellion and had to go on to form various more extreme splinter groups with the smaller numbers of people who think more like he does. We could join together and criticise that, except that the movie's insisting those people are the instigators of the whole climate issue, which is just ridiculous.
The climate problem, it is said, stems from the irresponsible actions of greedy, feckless individuals who have too many babies and drive too much and consume too many products, and of the capitalist corporations who pander to their whims. The solution is for government to have greater power to regulate private companies, but also to guide and reshape the lives and habits of individuals.
This is a fair comment criticism of that particular perspective. It has nothing to do with the science of climate change, but everything to do with how people respond to it. Because yes, you can respond by asking the question, how do we change the system so the things people want, the prosperity that we treasure, is defended, while we also address the problem of physics that we have to solve? Alternatively, you can ask the question, how do we change people to not want the things and to give up the prosperity so that we can solve the problem? But also, let's be clear, to do the things that the people saying it wanted to do already, but they can now justify in a different way. Now, that's a powerful critique. Whenever these issues come along, people tend to look at them through the eyes of, how can this new problem support my pre-existing worldview? And we are endlessly creative of such things from all political traditions. And if it can't be utilised, then how can we discredit it? Which is kind of how we got to this movie.
All of these things require the government to get involved, right? Because the government has to sort of force changes upon the public. If it was up to the public, we wouldn't be buying electric vehicles.
Well, they probably would, but they would want them to be better and to be cheaper first, which is understandable. People, including especially the people who made this movie, probably complained to the skies when the first low-energy light bulbs were introduced. They certainly weren't alone because, in performance terms, those things were junk. But they got better. Now it's pretty much a non-issue. Nobody complains about light bulbs anymore. The same process will probably play out with most of these other technologies, but the real challenge, as the movie makers could have argued more powerfully without all the fluff, is when governments force for pace in ways that go too far and too fast. Governments are not very competent, not when it comes to micromanaging a lot of that stuff. But you can't easily be the powerful critic of that if your position is simply, there's no problem, nothing's happening, it's all made up by a worldwide conspiracy of scientists. And that brings us back to the poor me theme.
Professors Henrik Svensmark and Nir Shaviv describe what happened when they published their results on the climatic effects of solar activity.
It was like all hell had broken loose because of this work. I had no idea that things would escalate as they did, and it completely changed my life.
Once we said that, people didn't like hearing it, and we became a persona non grata.
I don't know enough about that individual case to know whether it's being accurately represented here, but it may well be. It is certainly the case in our modern polarised world that people are way too prone to cancel people they disagree with, something that I have criticised on this channel often. But you know, I am also aware of plenty of mainstream climate scientists who get actual death threats from the other side. I haven't seen those condemned by the people on that side. This isn't whataboutery. I believe firmly in free speech, and that people should be able to hold and promote their unpopular opinions regardless of the topic, regardless of the side. Svensmark shouldn't have had his character attacked. Michael Mann, who, by the way, blocked me on Twitter, along with half of the rest of the world, likewise. And I can guarantee that even mentioning that last one will have foaming at the mouth comments below this video, which is rather the point. If you only defend the free speech of the people on your side, then you don't really believe in free speech, right? Then we go deeper into the politics. Climate versus freedom.
Global warming is like the perfect problem that government can get involved in to grow the influence of government.
Is it, though? Again, I don't see many mainstream politicians thinking that way. They see it as a difficult issue, where they believe that action on the science has been pushed back, the can has been kicked down the road, but can now no longer be pushed back any further. They're still entirely aware that the trade-offs involved can be career-ending for them, so they still push back the most difficult elements whenever they think they can get away with it. But of course, we come into a key point here.
If there's an existential threat out there that's worldwide, well, you need a powerful worldwide government, to cope with it.
Here's the thing. There are globalists out there. Not as many as the movie producers seem to think, but like everyone else, they have the right to promote their ideas, so long as people have the right to scrutinise and potentially reject them. If there is a real problem that we have to solve, and you decide you're going to stick your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist, well, guess what's the consequence of that? You leave a policy vacuum for your opponents to fill. If you hate big government, but your response to the problem of global warming is to do nothing, where is the better political alternative you could be presenting that actually solves the problem without resorting to big government? The one that's based on preserving freedom, defending people's communities and values. Are you saying that your political perspective is incapable of dealing with a global problem? Because that wouldn't be a good look. Maybe you should start channeling Margaret Thatcher a little more and, I hesitate to say it, but Donald Trump a little less. Because look, the left is going to hate you, whichever one you do, so don't worry on that score. But one approach will stand you in better stead as temperatures continue to climb and the consequences continue to become more and more visible. The other approach, sooner or later, the laws of gravity are going to kick in. Instead, we are told the only reason people are believing in the issue is because
the publicly funded establishment in the West is so large and powerful. It is able to impose and enforce the official consensus on climate through its control of schools, universities, government, and much of the media.
Some of that is because schools and universities have a duty to teach good science founded on research and observation. Again, if you wanted to highlight the areas where genuinely ideological teachers go further than that and start pushing doomism and political messaging to students, we would have a lot to agree about. But in the same way that the people who want schools to be teaching creationism are not the best critic of the existing curriculum, so it is here.
What normally happens in an emergency is that all normal forms of openness and democracy have to be suppressed.
At last, a basic statement I can just say fair comment to. That is indeed why Extinction Rebellion started calling for the declaration of a climate emergency.
Activists are even calling for any skepticism to be criminalized.
Again, fair comment. I even had commenters to this channel saying that they looked forward to me appearing in The Hague as a result of me criticising some of the doomist messaging. Not to be taken seriously, but there are many more who want to demonise the leaders of various businesses and political organisations with deadly seriousness. I remember when I interviewed Roger Hallam early in the whole progression of that stuff. After the interview, he said I should join him in taking action and ending up in prison. I said to him, "Don't worry, Roger. Once you've taken over, I expect I'll be in prison soon enough." Don't think he appreciated the joke.
In certain jobs and professions, it is now dangerous to express dissent on climate.
It's no surprise that people who are more skeptical will think twice before voicing their concerns, because they might risk their careers, they might risk their business, they might risk being sacked.
Again, fair comment. We don't agree with people being cancelled for their personal opinions. Unless those opinions make them incapable of doing a job of work that they've been hired to do, but that is rarely the case, let's be clear.
The consequence is a censorious, authoritarian regime that has to control every move, every word, everything you want to do.
Well, we're on a roll here because, yes, I too am against becoming part of an authoritarian regime. One could dispute whether the entire climate science community is arguing for such a regime. They're not. Or whether the majority of politicians bringing in policies to tackle climate change are aiming for such an outcome. They're not. But it is absolutely true to say that this agenda can be used by those who would absolutely want to go there. Eco-fascism is certainly a thing. If we seriously screw things up over the coming decades, it's not inconceivable we could end up with something like it. Ironically, ignoring the problem until it becomes more visible and a bigger crisis kind of is compatible with making that more likely, but it's still pretty much a minority possibility, at least divorced from other political and geopolitical events outside of the scope of this discussion. It's not inappropriate to caution against it, while not being overly helpful to see it lurking behind every rock. We then get climate versus the people.
Climate protesters condemn capitalism. But at their anti-capitalist rallies, it's hard to spot anyone who looks like a worker.
Which isn't about climate versus the people, though. Of course, it's about anti-capitalist protesters against the people. And with that as the premise, you get more coherent opinion makers pitching in because it's an area for fair comment, whether you agree with their position or not. So, for instance, you have Claire Fox, Baroness Fox.
The modern capitalist system has led to prosperity. More and more people have more and more things. The modern anti-capitalism of the present time is a critique of capitalism that it gives us too much.
I interviewed Claire Fox, as she was then, a few years ago. Have a lot of respect for her and her role in politics since that interview. It's fun to note that with her background as a former leading light in the Revolutionary Communist Party, you could imagine how the makers of this movie would have cast her if her opinion had been the opposite. She, of course, has moved on since those days, as indeed all of us are allowed to do, whether or not Wikipedia keeps up. Interestingly, she and her fellow communists were always against the environmentalists when she was active there. Something that isn't remotely touched upon in this movie or understood by those who accept its rewriting of political history is that the left used to look incredibly warily at the environment as an issue back in the 1980s and the 1990s. At that point, they still defined themselves as representing the interests of the working classes, and they saw the environmental issues as being a threat to the jobs and the other interests of that group. Just as the movie makers do now, in fact. Things moved on, but arguably the fact that many of those attitudes ended up shifting to the libertarian right is exactly how Claire Fox ended up sort of there. I mean, I don't mean to put words in her mouth as to where she positions herself. Anyway, what she says here makes perfect sense. Even if you disagree with it, it's a viable argument based on observation. In politics, unlike with science, that doesn't necessarily make it right, because you bring various values and preferences to the table. I think you can both recognise the enormous benefits capitalism has brought, as I have here many times, and also that it brings with it unintended consequences that should ideally be addressed. What you do with that trade-off comes down to your political perspective, which is why we have debate.
It seems that what upsets many environmentalists is not the failure, but rather the success of capitalism.
Again, fair comment. I'd be interested to know, though, what percentage of people who would identify as environmentalists would actually fall into that category. I mean, I just have no data to go on. What they've given us is a broad generalisation. There are highly visible and loud anti-capitalist environmental campaigners. There's also a number who are more moderate and focused on pragmatism and what works. Is it a quiet majority? Who knows? If anyone's seen research on that, let me know in the comments below. The makers of this movie are doing what us versus them groups always do, which is to recognise the nuance in their own side, all the people who agree on the core issues while disagreeing maybe vigorously on the details, while seeing the other side as a homogeneous group, usually at that defined by the worst of that group. So I can quite believe that they imagine that all campaigners, all climate scientists, all business leaders who act on the issue, all of those people are secretly anti-capitalists acting purely on ideology. Which, if you're not dug deeply into the trenches on their side, seems a fairly remarkable proposition.
The people behind the climate alarm couldn't give a damn about manufacturing. They have nothing to do with it. They don't know people who work in manufacturing whose jobs and lives depend on it. They're not excited by industry or industrial progress. They explicitly want to shut it down.
Again, a broad generalisation. No, most people don't explicitly want to shut manufacturing down. That extreme position is really just, well, the extremists. But you can see why, if you're trying to rally the support of ordinary people to your side, you would want to have them believe it. And of course, the likes of Extinction Rebellion go out of their way to make that easy by annoying specifically those people. So good job there. And then finally, we get to climate versus the poor. Again, what they mean is certain types of climate policies and certain ideologues against the poor. If you really wanted to talk about climate against the poor, you could talk about how the front lines of current and expected climate change, falling as they do a lot in Asia and Africa, directly affect poorer communities. But as this movie correctly points out, seeking to deprive those communities of cheap and reliable energy would not be helping them in that situation.
According to many leading environmentalists, the world's poorest people should not aspire to the lifestyle of people in the first world. The planet will not cope.
I don't think that what they've said there is a majority position, but there is no doubt that there is some badly crafted policy that has resulted in poor outcomes, and there certainly are some people, the spirit of whose discourse, even if not the detail, would result in that as an outcome. We can join together in criticising those. Now, I've not seen the movie makers expressing concern for the poor in any context other than it being used as a stick to beat climate change, but let's take it that people are people and we actually want good outcomes for those in the worst situations. I think it's good if people engage with what helps to lift communities out of poverty. If a challenge to bad programs that provide second-rate energy for communities that need better, if that can help to spur improvements, that's a good thing. I doubt that will end up with people just shrugging their shoulders and saying fossil fuels are the only answer, but that's fine, because if people don't want that to be the answer, then they're challenged to provide better solutions. If those better solutions can never exist, then that's kind of a problem, I would have thought.
Around a third of the food produced in Africa rots before it ever reaches the mouths of consumers. To prevent this terrible waste, Africa needs plastic packaging, refrigerated lorries, and good roads.
This is true. Most food waste in developing countries occurs before it reaches the consumer. As much waste happens in developed economies, but that usually it's wasted by consumers at the end of the chain. How one deals with that challenge, since we're in favour of capitalism, is an interesting question. The movie makers here don't seem to be so interested in that one, but fair enough, you can only include so much in a movie. So maybe they are?
When they use the word sustainable development, they're talking about no development. Exactly. I mean, the point is that, to develop sustainably means not to use too much energy, not to use too much carbon, net zero, the idea that you mustn't use too many resources, the fact you mustn't produce enough consumer goods because consumption is bad. So ultimately, the idea of development is out the window.
I need a reference for that. I've known quite a few people who use that phrase, never a single one where that cynical version applied. Now, I dare say such people may exist. I just don't think they're representative. Of course, if the policies on the ground result in the same thing, then it's still a fair criticism. But we're not given the detail of any such programs, so I don't know if it's a comment based on knowledge or just generalizations made in ignorance. I've added the author's book to my to-read list, so maybe I'll find out in due course.
But climate alarmists have a problem.
Climate alarmists. Remind me, who were they again?
Many countries in Africa and across Asia are simply ignoring the environmentalist demands of Western governments and international agencies. Communist China is estimated to be building an average of 2 new coal power plants a week. China now uses more coal than the rest of the world combined.
I don't know if this is disingenuous or just ignorance. In any case, it's wrong big picture, whilst pointing correctly at certain details. A 2 + 2 = 1 million equation. China is pursuing a rational strategy for its position. I mean, it's a centralised dictatorship, so lots of the details are badly implemented as it creates perverse incentives with people not willing to provide critical feedback up the chain of command. Nevertheless, simply ignoring the demands is plain wrong. China accepts 100% that climate change is real. It does not get its climate science filtered via Fox News. It knows that it's vulnerable to climate change since it has historically had major climate events, dynasty-ending events. and it has been seeing lots of dramatic floods and heat waves in recent years, more than most in fact. It also has less productive agricultural land per head of population than any other country just about, so it's vulnerable. Hence why it has set the target of net zero by 2060, and it is investing massively in all energy sources to achieve energy security in the short term, solar, wind, nuclear and coal, and that's because it doesn't want to be constrained in its growth as it pulls more of its people out of rural poverty, but it has committed to, and is seen by outside observers to be acting broadly in line with, peaking those carbon emissions before 2030 and starting their decline from there. It insists it's going to do it its way and not the way that America would tell it to do, but it's also said that unlike America, it will actually meet its commitments. That may or may not be how history eventually records it. We will have to see. I always think it's weird that Americans, the people who built a world power out of innovation, can both complain that China isn't, quote, doing anything on climate change, and then in the same breath complain that if they want to buy wind turbines or solar panels or electric vehicles, they're all being made in China. How do we think that happened then? China is pushing ahead with electric vehicles, for example, for its own population, and the same with different clean energy types, investing way more in fourth-generation nuclear, for instance. And it, as America used to do long ago, has identified the inevitable changes coming and decided that the path to becoming a world power is to dominate the industries of tomorrow. Meanwhile, America is clinging to the status quo, potentially electing someone who will actively shut down innovation in those areas for the next 4 years. Now look, if you believe in capitalism, as the movie makers say they do, wouldn't you recognise that was exactly the dynamic market at work? But no, instead it's all because of government subsidies. Climate change is not happening, and China's doing nothing, Japan's doing nothing, India's doing nothing, everybody else is doing nothing. Well, good luck with that as a market-based proposition. We had people who tried the same back in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. They were known as Luddites. Didn't work out for them, but okay, maybe this time will be different. Now, at this point in the movie, mercifully, we are coming to a close.
In the West, too, for many people, climate alarmism is wearing thin.
Which is weird, because I heard that it was the perfect issue for politicians who wanted to achieve big government. From what you're saying now, sounds like these might actually be, tricky issues laden with difficult trade-offs.
Ordinary people are not stupid. They have seen one ridiculous claim after another fail over and over. What this does is leave people with a profound and justified cynicism about what the scientific establishment says and about what the government says.
Again, that appeal to ordinary people. We're on your side. The other side makes ridiculous claims that have failed. And that's not the fault of extremist campaigners, the anti-capitalists we've been talking about for the last few segments. But once again, we're back to the science establishment, the governments, all of them. Because the big fault line in the whole movie is that it seeks to persuade you that it's all just one group. So, there it is. My conclusion from having waded through all of this is that we desperately need a better political opposition. Because it's definitely a problem that across the world, governments are embarking on programs of the most significant transition in human history. They are trying to do many big changes all at once. Given the general low competence baseline for governments and the machinery of administration they use, it's a guarantee for mistakes, unintended consequences, perverse incentives, opportunities for out-and-out fraud, as well as cowardice in the face of difficult decisions. In most countries, there is no credible opposition that is actually holding them to account for all of that. In a system that expects scrutiny and accountability through having a loyal opposition. In other words, scrutiny from a different perspective based on what the solution should be to what we all agree is a problem. The problem is that what opposition there is, tiny as it may be, is thoroughly discredited because it's associated with this head-in-the-sand alternative reality stuff that says what's being done is wrong because there's no problem. Not that collectivist centralised policies are bad, not that financial realities are not being faced and declared honestly to the electorate, not that the needs of poorer communities aren't being taken into account, but because, la 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 la, I can't hear you, we're going to believe in flat earth theories based on made-up graphs and multiple competing theories, none of which have credible evidence to back them up. It's a shame. Effective legislation in the UK on pollution started with the conservative tradition. Property rights were the first truly legal device to force polluters to pay recompense to their neighbours. The same conservative tradition has struggled to have a similarly powerful response to global issues like this one. But be in their interest to at least try it, it seems to me, because there's only so long you can keep pointing to high peaks in natural variability and arguing that it represents the start of a so-called pause, and only so long you can find increasingly odd locations, Central Park in New York for goodness sake, which you can pretend shows the entire planet isn't warming. And then what are you going to do? What is the end game? If you don't want this global issue to be the end of prosperity and innovation and human flourishing, do you really think people are going to watch this movie and then large numbers of them are going to be utterly persuaded they're all going to vote in Trump and Nigel Farage and everyone else equivalent across the world, and that then what? It's all going to go away? It's not a political strategy I would suggest has a huge amount of pragmatic savvy. The next few decades will be awkward and messy for sure. Progress will be in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back if we're lucky, mistakes will be made, consequences will be felt. You can decide every step back is a sign that you're about to triumph, just like the communists always thought that there was the sign of imminent capitalist collapse and the triumph of communism. Or we can just all get out of the cartoon-level trench warfare and engage with the world as it is, rather than as we would wish it to be. It's what every winning philosophy, empire, or corporation did as they were on the rise. See the world clearly. Ah well, I don't hold out much hope, but don't say you weren't told.